explains that? Well, part of it is a better economic backdrop. We've got GDP growth, something around 5%. The consensus expectations of 49 economists in the blue chip forecast around 3.8%. So that's a higher level of activity. There's not much inflation out there, inflation under control. So that's basically allowing companies to have that broader level of earnings growth with not a lot of pressure on input costs. So that's your margins are basically part of that's recovery. And so those are your two building blocks as we see it in our models. And the Fed has made it very clear, in our view, that they're on hold for the next 3 years at least, perhaps as long as 5 years, based on the economics forecast. So that's a pretty benign backdrop. It's a good backdrop for the equity market. And when you think about the asset allocators, the portfolio managers out there, around 50% of the assets are allocated to equities, about little less than 25% to bonds. So what's the alternative? Cash is offering zero, and so it's still an attractive place for the equity market, Jonathan.
David, that's the index story, beautifully laid out, going out to 2022. Let's talk about a sector-level story now. The overweights in the mix for Goldman, industrials, materials, heard a lot about that. The cyclical trade of the last month has played out wonderfully for so many people who had it on. You're staying overweight information technology. Why, David?
Jonathan, I want you to think about it three ways. You want to think about growth, you want to think about value, and you want to think about cyclicals. The growth story is basically duration. Equity duration, those longer-term cash flows at the zero lower bound. Those growth in mostly technology is prized. That's worth a lot, and they're likely to outperform. You have value. The best value absolutely is in healthcare. They are the cheapest relative to the market in 40 years. You got to go back to when early Clinton administration, when they were trying to restructure part of healthcare. You look at the Obamacare period of time 10 years ago, those are the only times that were similar. And actually, the valuation of healthcare is even more attractive than either of those two times. So that's your value trade and your value opportunity. And then the cyclical recovery, of course, is the pandemic relief coming from the vaccinations that we are assuming, and some of the industrial companies likely to benefit. So I think that's your three-pronged approach to kind of attacking the market. I think the other areas of the market likely to do less well. Financials, challenge of the flat yield curve, energy still under a lot of pressures, consumer staples, utilities, some of those other areas will be challenged. But those are the ways that I would break that down.
So what I'm hearing from you, David, is potentially adding on to what Andrew Slimmons of Morgan Stanley said earlier, which is perhaps the rally in some of the highest beta cyclical stocks, the travel sectors, the financials, areas that have gotten beaten up disproportionately during the pandemic, that perhaps has gotten a little ahead of itself. Is that accurate?
I would say certainly on the way you just, I would sort of break apart your question there. You say the financials, I think, have challenging headwinds in terms of the very flat yield curve. The fact that there's big reserves that need to be taken for the uncertainty on potential defaults from the consumer as well as the commercial side. The Federal Reserve has made regulations difficult to actually raise dividends. They're basically most of the banks limited to prohibited from buying back stock at this juncture. So those are some of the key drivers historically that have been benefiting financials when those are in play. They're not there right now. On the industrial side, the idea of vaccination, does offer some better opportunity for some of the travel sector and some of those industrial categories. I might point to some of the aerospace defense companies as well. I think the way to think about value opportunities is to look at the 2021 and 2022 level of profits and compare those with the pre-pandemic level of profits in 2019. So kind of make that comparison. And for the overall market, you'll be a little bit higher. Maybe you're about 7% higher. That's our estimates. 7% higher between 2019 and kind of go out to 2021. But you've got other areas, some areas where you got really depressed level of profits. Maybe they're 50%, 60%, as much as you had 2 years ago. I think that's the opportunity for a normalization. So that's where the value, we look at there, we see some of the travel and the hospitality area, they would fall into that category. Lisa, I want to pick up on one thing you said earlier. You were mentioning about credit and kind of what's happening on the equity market is telling a slightly different story from the credit market. because if you look at the strongest balance sheet companies, they're up 26% year to date. A portfolio of those. You compare that with a weak balance sheet portfolio, they're down 1%, and that's sector neutral, so that's not going to skew towards any one particular area. Yes, you're paying 35 times for a strong balance sheet, and you're paying 13 times for a weaker balance sheet portfolio. But that's telling us that portfolio managers are not totally embracing the idea that the economy is totally recovering and that we're sort of in the clear. And so you're seeing pockets of opportunity, and I would say if you have a view that there's a path towards normalization, some of the weaker balance sheet companies would be attractive at this juncture, and they tend to be clustered around some of the pandemic, companies that have been hurt most in the pandemic.
Hey, David, you always make it sound so easy, the path to 4,600. It's great to catch up, sir, as always. David Kostin there of Goldman Sachs. Thank you. That was the road towards 4,600 at the back end of 2022, Tom.
I just can't say enough about these bulls, Ben Ladler, David Kostin, and the others. Boy, have they been right. There's just nothing more to say. The bears are silent.
The roaring 20s for Goldman Sachs. I hope so. Coming up, Julie Norman, University College London professor.
With the First Word News, I'm Rishika Gupta. The UK has become the first Western country to approve a coronavirus vaccine. British regulators have given emergency authorization to the shot developed by Pfizer and BioNTech. The two companies have said their vaccine is 95% effective in preventing the illness. It will be available in the UK starting next week. President-elect Joe Biden won't quickly end that Phase 1 trade deal with China. Biden told the New York Times he first wants to conduct a review of U.S. policy with Beijing, and that will include consulting with key allies. Biden also said he wouldn't make any immediate moves on tariffs imposed by President Trump. In Hong Kong, activist Joshua Wong was sentenced to more than a year in jail for leading a protest outside police headquarters last year. It was one of the most high-profile cases in the government's crackdown on the pro-democracy movement. Two other members of Wong's now disbanded political party received shorter sentences. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Rishika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
for relief to address these urgent needs. But any package passed in a lame duck session is likely to be at best just a start. My transition team is already working on what I'll put forward in the next Congress to address the multiple crises we're facing.
That was President-elect Joe Biden on the crisis we're facing and his response